Hello everyone and welcome to the Green Man channel. Hope you're doing good and well. So it's time for another top 10 horror films countdown list for a particular year. And this time I'm counting down my favourite horror films from the year 2020. Now I actually have to admit this took me a while to prepare this list, partly because I had to revisit a lot of horror films from that year. I mean it took me quite a lot of thought, and I realised that I'm going to have to rewatch these films to work out what my actual order of what my favourite films from that year would be. Also, I guess you had a small thing called the pandemic, which I think meant that probably quite a few horror films were actually postponed. So it didn't feel like there, for me anyway, there was as long a list to choose from as there usually is, or as many films that I saw that I could choose from. So those kind of reasons are why I haven't actually gotten around to doing this particular video of a top 10 horror films countdown for 2020 until now. My last list, of course, was my top 10 horror films of 2021. But anyway, as always, and without any further ado, let's start the countdown for my top 10 horror films of 2020. And at number 10, we've got The Rental, which was directed by Dave Franco. Now, for me, the strength of this film was actually its build-up of the character relationships and the drama between the characters, more so than, for me, the actual horror elements of the film. I really thought the strength of this film was in its drama and in those inter-character tensions and what was going on between them and what you found out as the horror film went on. I really thought the way that, you know, certain aspects of the characters and revelations about them were hidden very well as well until like later on in the film. All those parts of the film were really strong, but for me the horror side of the film wasn't as good or wasn't quite as strong. Which means overall my reflections on this film is it's actually a pretty decent film, but as a horror film not quite as good, but it still makes my number 10. I still think it's a very respectable movie and a pretty good one, directed by Dave Franco, and it comes in at number 10. Now my number 9 is a film called Nocturne, which is directed by Zoo Quirk, and this stars Sydney Sweeney as Juliet, and it's actually a film kind of about this rivalry between these two sisters who are both classical pianists. They're both trying to get a showcase performance, and there's all these tensions developing between them. I really enjoy Sydney Sweeney's performance in this particular movie, and you know, I also like the visuals as well and the suspense that's used. It is a very, very slow burn psychological type of film, and I have very recently said how I tend not to like too many of those kind of films, but I can make exceptions, and I do think this is one of the better ones that certainly I saw in that year. I feel like it warrants its number 9 spot on my top 10 horror films of 2020. Now, coming up at number 8, we have a film that I might describe a little bit as a guilty pleasure type of film from 2020, which really isn't all that great. And in fact, I thought the second half of this horror film was very, very derivative of the film Hostel. But the first half of this, with its sort of, you know, game-based horror, its survival aspects, its tensions, again, you know, were a little bit like the films Escape Room and Saw, because you had traps. But I really liked the way, for the first half of the film, a lot of the characters didn't actually know that they were actually in death traps, so to speak. And they had to work that out for themselves. You know, they'd signed up to something, these characters, these friends in this movie, and they didn't really know what they were getting into. And they thought they were just in escape rooms or just kind of these puzzle rooms. They didn't realise that actually they might just be in life-threatening traps, and they had to work that out for themselves. I enjoyed that part of the movie. The film is, as I say, not a great film, but it makes it to my number 8, I think, because I was very entertained by quite a large portion of the film, and felt, you know, I'd put it at my number 8 of my top 10 horror films of 2020 for that reason. Now, coming in at number 7, we have actually, I think, a very, very good horror film, and this is The Invisible Man. And I can remember seeing lots of promotion for this movie, you know, the posters on the at train stations and on the side of buses, adverts for it, and lots of promotion for this movie in early 2020. This actually came out before the pandemic really struck, and this of course stars Elisabeth Moss, and I think when you've got that kind of acting gravitas, you're likely to be in for at least a really great performance, even if the overall film isn't quite so good. But in this case, the film is very, very good, I think. It's directed by Leigh Whannell, of course, who many of you, I'm sure, if you're horror fans, you've heard that name before. And I really enjoyed, again, this was a little bit slow burn, but some really great moments in it. A superb scene for me in this film was when Elisabeth Moss's character, whose temporarily the name of whom has left my mind briefly, but Also, you've got Emily, and they're both sat down at a dinner table, and there's this scene where kind of a knife appears, and maybe I shouldn't spoil it, but it's quite some scene, I think, and brilliantly delivered. And it's just a really good film, I think, from that year. I'm putting it at my number 7 because I think, it's not higher, and it could be higher, to be honest, but I think the next 6 films I do like a little more to watch and to re-watch. So I'm going for, The Invisible Man at number 7. Coming in at number 6 is The Dark and the Wicked, directed by Brian Bettino. Bettini or Bettino? I think Brian Bettino. And this is I thought this is a very enjoyable horror film. It's incredibly dark. It lives up to its name a bit, I think, The Dark and the Wicked. Great sort of family-based sort of horror film, developing characters quite well. Really kind of some really scary, suspenseful scenes with some real kind of great jump scare moments. Really, really well done. For me, it's almost too dark, and it's why it's not quite higher, because I think it's a really good film, and I did get it also on DVD recently as well to watch it again. But it's almost a little too dark for me for it to be any higher than number 6. It's kind of, with horror, I like just a tinge of a lighter sense about it, just a little bit of lightness, a little bit of humour maybe somewhere, even if there's not a lot of it. But this film was out and out really dark and pretty depressing, but still a very good horror film, as I say. Coming at number 6, The Dark and the Wicked. Now, at number 5, we've got Brandon Cronenberg's Possessor. Now, I have said and sung the praises of this director pretty recently because I absolutely adored Infinity Pool last year, and it made my number 1 horror film of that year because it blew my mind. It was so bold, it was so wild, but so brilliant at the same time. And this is kind of a similar thing with Possessor. It's another really great horror film, I think, from Brandon Cronenberg. I love the idea, the concepts. It's a bit sci-fi, this assassin that takes over people's bodies by, effectively putting implants into their brains. And you get some absolutely brilliant, some very violent scenes as well, some really good action scenes. Typically Cronenberg, disorientating styles, and really great visuals. It's another really good horror film from 2020, this one, and it comes in at number 5, that's Possessor. Now, next up at number 4, we've got a film called His House, which was directed by Remy Weeks. This is another really excellent horror film, and it's a really interesting movie that pairs up this sort of refugee drama, or this refugee story, with some quite, genuinely, I think, very disturbing horror, and pairs the two beautifully together. So beautifully that it's like, you genuinely feel and believe the emotions of the characters, and you genuinely feel the horror all together in this kind of, like I say, brilliantly merged together, contrasting elements. And I think there's real emotion in the story and in the characters. Beautifully done, beautifully built up. That's why His House is coming in at my number 4. Next up, we move on to my number 3, which is The Night House. This one was directed by David Bruckner. And I think this is, there's actually quite a few movies with the word house in this. No, just a couple with the word house in. But The Night House stars Rebecca Hall, and she puts in an absolute blinder of a performance. She is fantastic. I almost feel like this woman should have won an award for her performance in this film. For me, actually, if you take away her performance, the film probably isn't nearly as good, and certainly wouldn't be number 3 on my list. I do feel like the Rebecca Hall performance is a big reason why this film is at number 3, because she's absolutely fantastic. You really feel her grief, you really feel her hurt, her pain for, not just losing her husband who had committed suicide, but for what she then goes through afterwards, the people she meets that were involved or that she thinks were involved with him, and it just builds up to this fantastic climax. I think, again, this one is a bit of a slow burn. 2020 I thought was a bit of a year of slow burn horror, but slow burn horror largely done well in the cases of this top 10 list. And The Night House is actually a really, really great film. Perhaps a bit of a dark horse. Don't know. Maybe I shouldn't say that because I don't know truly what people think of that film. But it's genuinely really good. I think, as I say, Rebecca Hall makes this film better than I think it otherwise would have been, but still a very, very good horror film coming in at my number 3 here. That leaves us just with 2 left, and the number 2 is a film called The Last Matinee. This was directed by Maximilio Contenti, I think. Again, I can't read my own writing here a little bit, but never mind. This is a really great setup of a slasher horror kind of a film with everybody sat in a kind of theatre, and the kills are happening whilst they're actually watching a film. And the film very cleverly sets up those moments, those kills. I think it builds up the tension really well. I think it's got some good characters in it. It doesn't feel like it's just a mindless slasher, basically, is what I'm saying. I think it's a smart slasher. And I love the idea. I love the setup of everybody actually, being in a theatre, all sat down, watching a film, a scary film as well, but without realising that, lurking somewhere is an actual killer that's, killing them off one by one effectively. And some of the kills are really great as well. And I love the main characters, the core characters that I think that were in this film. Although I did find this sort of, the scenes towards the end got predictable. You could see them coming, or at least, someone who's seen a lot of slashers, I could see what happened towards the end of this one coming up, which is why it's probably not quite my number 1 film of 2020 or horror film of 2020, but still a blast. And if you like slashers and you haven't seen The Last Matinee, definitely worth a watch. Now, my number 1 film is actually probably a popular choice, and I thought it was brilliant. And it's a minimalist film, this one, which is another kind of film I talked about recently where I said I don't really like too many of these minimalist movies, yet here we go. My number 1 horror film from 2020 is actually very minimalist. It's called Host. It's all done on a Zoom call. But the reason I think this film works is partly because of the characters in the Zoom call. I also think the writing, the scripts, the dialogue's very good. And then the scenes where there's actually the dangers and the horror elements are fantastic. The camera angles, the way they go, the sort of the nerves, the tension, the fact it was very relatable that year as well in 2020 also I think adds a level of, relatability, or just a level of something you could, something could really feel that year, that sort of, and you could probably feel the scares more when you, like I myself had a load of Zoom calls during that time, so, or, Skype calls or Teams calls. So I absolutely could sense the sort of, the scare moments during that time as well. Just thought it was a really good horror film from that year, and it's made my number 1 horror film of the year 2020. So let me know, guys, what your favourite films, your top 10 horror films, maybe of 2020, or top 5, or just your favourite one. Let me know in the comments. Otherwise, until next time, everybody, have great weekends, and bye for now.